Broadcasting from deep behind enemy lines in the occupied territory of the Socialist Republic of California. Your host, former California State Assemblyman and Governor candidate, Tim Donnelly.
Hey, we've got an action-packed show for you today, including Stephen Greenhut of the San Diego Union-Tribune, who's going to weigh in. Don't look now. Don't let your wallet out of your sight, because the legislature is back in session and they have a penchant for wanting to spend more money. The minute that there are any more revenues, they consider them excess, and they have all kinds of plans on spending every penny that comes in and then 80 cents more for every dollar, so that, they just have to come back to you and get more money. So you're definitely not going to miss that segment. We've also got John Guandolo, who is going to check in and let us know what's going on with the threat of Islamic jihadism, which I know is a huge concern and of great interest to all of the listeners of this show, especially since it reared its ugly head here in our community. It's no longer something that we can say just happens somewhere else. And it's critically important that we continue to educate ourselves. So we'll be checking in with him. But right now, we've got some strange things are happening, and good things. I mean, if you consider that Barack Hussein Obama wants to confiscate your guns, and he does. He wants to completely nullify the Second Amendment. I don't believe a word that he says. The man is a sociopath. We'll be talking about his tears a little bit later on. But the idea that we're going to put somebody into the presidency at the very moment that the entire world seems to be collapsing. We've got North Korea saying they've detonated a hydrogen bomb. We've got Iran, who has been given a license to get a nuke by Barack Hussein Obama. He's said, to hell with the American people, to hell with the interest of the American people. Basically, when you look at Barack Hussein Obama's actions, he is a man without a conscience. He is a man that has decided he wants to take down and destroy this country. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And I haven't been saying that since the beginning, because it wasn't as evident as it is now. It is so crystal clear. Every single thing you look at, every time he takes on an issue, it is always an issue that helps him, helps his cause, but does damage to this country. He has undermined police everywhere by always taking the side of anyone who's black that happens to be accused of committing a crime on a large stage. He embroils himself in pedestrian issues of that nature instead of taking a hands-off approach, letting justice seek its course. And then, of course, if justice isn't served, then maybe he could step in. But no, he is, in my opinion, he is looking to completely undermine the fabric of the United States. He wants to see it collapse. And all you have to do is look around. Every deal that he has struck is in the interest of other countries, not ours. When you look at if we ever get a chance to look at the TPP, the toilet paper trade package, this monolithic trade deal that encompasses all these countries, it gives a lot of these countries sovereignty over the United States and over local issues. And so there you see him waging economic war against us. And then when you take the issue of gun control, he has been gunning, excuse the pun, he has been gunning for our guns since long before he even got in there. And here's the part that is so remarkable. You've got all these so-called intelligent, well-educated, PhD, master degree journalists who can't figure out that they should go to the places where you have the most extreme gun control, like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and others, Baltimore, and see what war zones they are. Because it's so hard to get a gun to defend yourself against the out-of-control crime. Because under Obama, we don't want to put people away. We don't want to actually admit that there are evil people and that they need to be put away. And because of that, and then again, as I said, he's undermined the cops. So you don't have you've outsourced your security to the police by not allowing you to have a gun in many of these cities. And then when the police are undermined, and then they're not going to do their job because it's become political hot potato and they don't want to get kicked off, get fired. So they back off. Next thing you know, people are dying in the streets. They're dying in the streets in record numbers. It's as if it is a war zone, a domestic war zone. And Obama's a smart guy. He knows all this. This is not lost on him. I think he's secretly celebrating. I think he's laughing. I think he is saying, gotcha. It is about damn time that we got back America for all the evil it's done in the world. That, I believe, is Obama's mentality and his mindset. So when you take into account all of that, when you take into account that Barack Hussein Obama wants to completely disarm you, he wants to effectively make guns so impossible or so expensive to get that people will give up on the Second Amendment since he won't be able to actually repeal it because that would never go through. And then you have Hillary, who's made it clear she has no problem confiscating your guns. She wants to do it with a buyback program like they did in Australia, but she wants your guns. She doesn't trust you to have your guns. She wants your guns. She wants to end the Second Amendment in America as we know it. And when you consider that, everything that happens relevant to the Clinton campaign, relevant to the Hillary Clinton campaign, is tremendously significant because we got to keep that woman out of the White House. Not because she's a woman, not because she's a Democrat, but because she wants to continue the work of Barack Hussein Obama in dismantling the protections that are in the Constitution for your rights. She's coming for your rights. And Donald Trump is doing a hell of a job going after her. He's got a new ad today on Twitter, and when you hear it, you'll get it. It's 20 or 30 seconds, but it literally in Hillary's voice talking about women's rights and how important they are. And in the background on the video, it's flashing a picture of Monica Lewinsky and Paula Jones and many, many others that have been assaulted by Bill Clinton. And by the way, he got questioned about it today. We're going to play you a clip when we get back. Take a quick break here, and whatever you do, don't touch that dial. Hey, don't worry. You came to the right place. We are going to continue to analyze the sociopath in chief. We'll do it later on in the show today. Got some great guests coming up with... we're going to get you back to what's going on meanwhile in California. But for right now, we're going to play you a clip. Bill Clinton got tracked down. Donald Trump put out an ad. This is the way it goes. He put out an ad and provoked reporters to ask questions about Donald Trump's attack on Hillary and on Bill in terms of the whole women's rights and sexual assault victims that Hillary has made a cornerstone, a key piece of her entire campaign. And it kind of backfired on it because Bill is now running from reporters. Check it out.
Trump is again today making an issue of your past transgressions. Do you want to respond? And are you worried that your past could hurt your wife's campaign?
I don't have any response. If he wins the Republican nomination, we'll have plenty of time to talk about it. If Hillary wins, I think I have no interest in getting involved in their politics or doing anything except trying to help Hillary.
Thank you guys. What's your reaction to Juanita Broderick's reemergence? Mr. President, he says you're skeptical. You're going to not accuse Juanita Broderick's reemergence?
He said a lot of things.
What's your reaction to Juanita Broderick's reemergence?
It's amazing to see MSNBC reporters going after Bill Clinton after all these years. It's not like this news hasn't been out there. I saw an article in which Juanita Broderick had sent a tweet and basically said, "This happened to me when I was 35 back in 1978, and I'm 73 today." So, I mean, because it happened during his first run for governor of Arkansas. And here's the thing. You can't run around, Hillary can't run around and say, women's rights matter. Women are so important. As a matter of fact, we have, rather than me say it, let me let you hear Hillary. This is a Donald Trump ad. Check this out, and I'll tell you what's going on the video after you hear it.
Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights, once and for all. Let's keep fighting for opportunity and dignity.
Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights, and the whole time that's playing, you're seeing pictures of Bill Clinton with Paula Jones. You're seeing that guy, Bill Cosby. Hillary standing next to Bill Cosby. You see her standing with Anthony Weiner. As a matter of fact, she hired Anthony Weiner's wife, Uma Abedin, who is her like chief of staff or what have you. I'm not sure the exact title. And so every time you turn around, Hillary is taking the opposite viewpoint. She is actually going after the women and silencing them. And that's exactly what Juanita Broderick said. She said, first Bill raped me, and then Hillary tried to silence me, intimidated me into silence. I mean, when you look at that and you see this is a person who wants to carry the mantle of the most powerful office in the world and wants to become the champion. And look, being a champion for women's rights, being a champion for victims of sexual assault is fantastic. That's wonderful. We need that. But we don't need someone who is an absolute abject hypocrite. And when it came down to it, instead of doing the right thing, instead of siding with the women, instead of actually giving them a chance to be heard, she went out and she actually led the hit squads, if you believe some of the books that are out, and was personally hiring some of the PIs who then went and intimidated the victims. They would walk. There was one woman, she was jogging, and this bulky armed PI has been following her, and she's getting creeped out. And she finally turns around and confronts him, and her cat had disappeared. And he says, so how's your cat? Well, they took the cat and killed it. This is the kind of stuff that you see them doing. And when you see people doing this, I referred to Obama as a sociopath earlier. That's a person without a conscience, somebody who will continue to push. They don't care what effect it has on anyone else. And I believe Hillary is made from the same mold. In her mind, you are nothing more. If you don't agree with her, if you're not on board and think she's the most wonderful person in the world, then you're a piece of you know what. I almost said it there. I would have been in serious trouble. But when you look at Obama, and I don't know if you saw the video of him crying, the crocodile tears. They weren't real tears. I'm sorry. I think most people would have some emotion over kids being shot, and that's normal. But there's something really, really weird. And And we have a clip we're going to play a little bit later on of another talk show host who really analyzed the first time he gave a speech about Sandy Hook. And he doesn't sound like somebody who's about to cry because he's angry. He's very, very angry. And the anger is coming through. But the tears are faked. The tears are literally because he thinks he's supposed to do it. And I was doing a little bit of research, and there's a lady who wrote a book about 10 years ago. Her name is Casey. I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. It's Dr. Lillian Glass, and she wrote a book on body language. And somebody asked her to analyze body language, speech, and voice patterns, and that can be used to spot the possible sociopathic Casey Anthonys of the world. You remember that Casey Anthony who was involved in murdering people and had no conscience about it whatsoever. So one of the things that came out was her tears. And she talked about how she literally, her tears, she would wipe them with one hand and one eye at a time. And that's exactly, it's very chilling, but go back and watch that video. That's exactly what Obama did. And he kept looking around for the camera, almost begging for the camera. And look, when you're a public figure, when you're a so-called politician, one thing you do is you have to be aware of cameras. And Obama is more aware than the vast majority of politicians. But it's almost like he's looking to make sure they got the best angle. Did they really see the tears? Should I wipe it again? And he does one eye at a time. And it's weird because he keeps going back to that. And most people, look, if I were giving a speech and tears were streaming down my face and they were legitimate and justified, I would try not to wipe them away until a point at which it made sense and be as discreet as possible. That's how most people handle that. Obama is literally panning for the cameras, and he's using that to deprive you. Here's the sick part. Here's the twisted part. Here's where he has no conscience. He's not a fool. He knows that a gun in the hands of someone who is in distress, who is being attacked and threatened and assaulted, may be their only hope, especially if you have some kind of a sick, evil, twisted person who would be happy to kill children or innocent adults at a Christmas party like happened in San Bernardino. He knows that. But his goal is not to make America safer. His goal is not to end gun violence, as he says. His goal is to break the back of this country. And he knows as long as you are armed, it will be impossible to completely deprive you of your freedom. And to break America down and bring them down to the level of the rest of the world. That is his goal. Hey, we're going to switch gears. When we come back, we're going to have Stephen Greenhut talking about California blues. Hey, welcome back to the Radio Free California Network. I am Tim Donnelly, your host, former California State Assemblyman and radio governor here in the state of California. And we are going to be speaking shortly with the brilliant Stephen Greenhut, who continually exposes government waste. Meanwhile, I'm going to take a quick call before we get him on the line. See if we can get this thing to work. Hey, welcome to the show. Give me your first name and city.
This happens to be Steve Greenhut. How are you?
Oh, well, I'm looking at your number. It's 909. I'm thinking you're a 916 number. Okay. Well, I was going to say all kinds of nice things about you, Stephen.
I should have pretended I could call. I can ask myself a tough question, and then I can answer it.
Yeah. Man, we've been ranting and raving about gun control, you're going to be like a timeout for us. Talking about you wrote a great article basically warning Californians that the legislature is back in session. They better keep their hands on their wallet.
Well, yeah, it's just unfortunately we don't have any control of our wallet anymore. And who was it who said that what the most dangerous time is when the legislature's in session and they're out to spend. And the thing that's frustrating today, I was at the press conference where the governor released his budget. And I asked him about unfunded liabilities, the debts, to pay for the past spending. And he said, well, we'll negotiate with the public sector unions, and then made it clear that they'll probably be negotiating for raises in June, and that they have to set aside more money for that. So there's just this one-way ratchet, right? It's always, and nobody, and even largely the Republicans, aren't interested in discussing alternative ways to stretch our current dollars. And we see through all the various auditors and inspector generals and LAO reports that Caltrans, for instance, just squanders billions of dollars and doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And yet we just expect that if you just throw more money at it, all of a sudden things are going to get better. So I don't know. How do you derail that train?
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be no opposition. As you stated, I read a lot of news. I'm a news junkie now that I obviously cover the news 3 hours a day on radio, and I happen to notice there's a lot of action by the Democrats. You got I believe it's Kevin DeLeon and one of his cohorts that want to spend $2 billion building palaces for the homeless. And you've got 5 or 6 other massive spending proposals out there. But on the Republican side, it's almost so silent they're invisible. Is anybody doing anything to expose any of this?
Well, I don't see it. I mean, you were there and know better, but what are they thinking? Even I saw one of the finest conservative senators was there at a press conference with DeLeon promoting at least some parts of this homeless initiative. And it's like, I think they want to be loved. Is that what it is? And they want to be relevant, but they're not going to be relevant. They'll be used to advance the aims, which are always to spend more money. And then as we, it's kind of
that's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a really good point that they'll be used. Because in their desperation to be loved, you can apply this to a dating situation. They're so desperate they're willing to do anything, and they'll wind up getting used.
Yeah, and then the other thing, and you and I know we both have a really strong civil liberties bent. So when the Republicans do stick together, it's usually to do the wrong thing. Like, with the civil asset forfeiture reform, I think all of 2 or 4 Republicans voted for it, which
I couldn't believe that.
An expression of, it's, and I was giving a hard time to one very nice Republican who talks a lot about the Constitution. I'm like, well, you don't find many bills that are more simple expressions of the constitutional principle of due process, and yet you had some complex reason not to vote for it. So basically, which of course we know what the reason is, it's called the law enforcement unions. So people see that, right? They know that Republicans up here don't have any courage, and the Democrats are all about spending. And even when you can prove to them, the waste, graft, corruption, misuse of dollars, their own auditors point out these terrible things and the misuse of dollars. And look at the school systems. I mean, the ones that serve the poor in particular. You point it all out, and they just want to throw more money at it. And if you throw more money at a bad system, I mean, I don't have to tell you this, but how do you get them to think about fixing these things?
Yeah, and look, if we had a governor who actually cared about the bottom line and said, look, we have a certain job to do as a government. These are my priorities. These are the areas we're going to go after: waste, fraud, and abuse. And we're going to come back to you and read you the scorecard, as Reagan once said. It'd be nice if they'd read us a scorecard once in a while. And and then said, look, here is the benefit to the taxpayer, and we're going to return this money to you. So that, therefore, you begin to starve the government and shrink the budget, shrink the spending. And then if something comes up that's a real emergency, maybe you even have rainy day cash that you didn't even call rainy day. It was just excess money that you could use to pay cash instead of having to borrow. Like, I look at the $15 billion that they borrowed with Prop 1. It's 14 to 15 billion when you factor in all the interest over 40 years. All for what? $2-3 billion worth of water storage and dams that they could have done for cash.
Absolutely. And the Republicans were just so happy that they were getting any storage spent. But yeah, it could have. They spend more than that on bike trails, probably.
Yeah. Well, no, bike trails are in there. Bike trails are in the. They're in the water. They're in the pork package of Prop 1. I mean, here's the sad part. As you probably know, I was I think I was the only no vote until a Democrat figured out that they better have a Democrat that votes no, because otherwise I was going to be the guy writing the opposition in the ballot pamphlet that gets sent out statewide. And I know that horrified Jerry Brown, and he made a phone call. And all of a sudden there was one other person voting no on it.
Oh,
but I mean,
funny.
What a disaster.
I didn't realize that. Well,
it was the first time it went through the assembly, I was the only person voting no, and one of the old-time staffers came over to me, and he said, "Are you aware that if you're the only no vote against this, you will be the person who writes the opposition arguments in the ballot pamphlet?" And I said, "No, I didn't really know that, but thank you for letting me know that." Not even 5 minutes later, the thing came back from the Senate. We voted again, and all of a sudden, there was a Democrat opposing it.
That's a fabulous story. I mean, that's amazing, and it's a good insight into how things work in the Capitol, how cynical it all is.
And they knew this guy. They knew this guy would make arguments that wouldn't compel anybody either. They would be really pie in the sky environmental arguments on the far, far left.
It's not surprising at all. Now, Brown is considered to be the last adult in the room, which is ironic. And on, like today at the budget, he kept pointing to, it's welcome. He was reminding people that if you spend a lot of money on new permanent programs, and then when the recession comes, and they always do come, we'll have a big hole. And that's responsible and good. But then he was bragging about all the additional money that the state is spending. And then it's just this assumed attitude that, of course, the more government spends, the better it is. And, of course, I wish we could spend every last drop of everybody's money, but we just can't. We got to keep the budget balanced. And I don't know how to it just seems so obvious that giving the government as much money as possible in the history of mankind and the history of world governments, that's generally not been such a good thing. And I don't know what we have to do to make that clear. And then there was this tidbit that I think accentuates that point. He was talking about how we'd like to have more money for affordable housing and translated government constructed or subsidized low-income housing. Well, they said it costs $5 million a unit to build this stuff, so we need a lot more money. Now, think about that. $5 million
oh, my word.
Up here in... Right, wouldn't that, and okay, they were talking, it was Mayor Ed Lee of San Francisco who he was quoting, so it's an expensive housing market caused, of course, by all the growth controls, but separate issue. But even in San Francisco, $5 million could buy you a pretty nice place, and certainly, but that's what we're spending per unit. That's when government builds housing. When the private sector does it, obviously, not many people in the private sector, in the true private sector, would spend $5 million a unit on subsidized on low-income housing.
See, I'd be happy to see the government fully fund its budget to fix our roads. I'd like to see our dams and water infrastructure completed. And I'd like to see that done at the expense of all the non-essential social spending we do, because in the last couple of years, at least when I got there in 2010, we started out with a $30 billion budget deficit, and we figured out a way to cut about half of that, and I think the rest was a tax increase, ultimately with Prop 30 to close that gap. But people have figured out how to live without all that extra government money. And, it seems like there's a lot more productive uses for it in the private sector, but they don't seem to understand this is a zero-sum game. You pull the money out of here and give it to government, it's not available to build businesses which could grow and expand and create jobs.
Right, and you look at, and then of course government, they take our money and then they ladle it on the public employee unions, who then get these ridiculous salaries and pensions and all these different perks. And, it's just the money just goes away and it doesn't fix what was supposed to be fixed. And it's just the history of government, and yet there's never any appetite to consider alternative ways of doing things. Like those of us who are critics of the public school system, we're not against education. You obviously need schools. We just see that the government does a really poor job of doing it. And yeah, you need to build roads and these sorts of things. But the more government does, in general, the less it does for those core functions that it should be doing. And it's just like the more the police agencies spend on pensions and things for their officers, the less public safety spending you actually get. So the whole system is just a scam. It's largely run by the public employee unions on the benefit of the public employee unions. Republicans have no way to be relevant, so they desperately look for ways to be
loved.
Nice with the Democrats, to be loved. And then they end up not being loved. They end up being scorned and used and scorned. So, and then the public here just the public shrugs, and that's fundamentally what the problem is, right? If no one cares, well, then you get the government you want.
That's it. Hey, we're talking with Stephen Greenhut. If you're just tuning in, we'll take a quick break and come back. And if you got a question for him, 323-746-TALK. Hey, we're talking with Stephen Greenhut of the San Diego Union-Tribune. He writes, always somehow exposing government, exposing the scam, the shell game. Stephen, I was out shoveling snow this morning at about 5:30. And, because my wife had to get off to work and, to make sure that we keep supporting all this government. And it was a tale of two shovels. I used this aluminum shovel. And as I picked up the snow, which was really heavy and wet, because there were like two snowfalls. And if I got some of this snow that had fallen earlier, it would stick on the blade and I'd throw it, but then the weight wouldn't go away. I almost fell into the snowbank, right? And it just reminded me that then I picked up this plastic shovel, and it was like Bill Clinton. It was Teflon. I mean, I just shovel and throw it, and it just went, and every drop of snow was off the shovel, and it was easy and clean and neat. But shoveling with that first shovel, it made me feel like the government, that government burden, stopping you, weighing you down.
Well, that's a good analogy. Of course, when I left the Midwest, I came to a place that didn't have snow, so I've kind of put the whole shoveling thing out of my mind. But
wow, are you laughing at me? Is that what I'm getting?
No. I think here's a guy who lives in California and he's got to shovel snow. But I know you're in a very beautiful place up there.
And I left Michigan, to come here.
Well, I left Northwest Ohio for Orange County, but then I left Orange County for Sacramento, so I can't really talk. But I haven't come up here.
Something good had to come out of Ohio. I won't say anything more about Ohio. I went to Michigan, so that's all we need to say about that. But back. Don't say you went to Ohio State.
No. I went to George Washington, but yeah, up here in Sacramento, though, I mean, Ohio, Michigan is fine, but in Sacramento, this place it's a lovely city actually, but just the center of power for our state, and nothing much good comes out of it up here.
Well, we've only got a couple minutes left. I want you to get, what is the worst proposal that you've seen so far, either in the governor's budget or coming out of any of these legislators that you think our listeners ought to know about?
Let's see. The worst one it's pretty early. They only started introducing their bills on Monday, but there's, there are all sorts of, talk of general social spending enhancements and improvements and increases, and I think we're just going to see a whole lot of bad social spending bills. And it's not, obviously it's good to help people, but like we talked about, government doesn't do a very good job helping people. And what we don't hear discussed here is, the best way to help people is to make it easier for them to get a job. Meanwhile, we're destroying the state. I hate saying
or start a business.
I mean, our state. Yeah, just make it really, our state government makes it very hard to start a business. They make it very hard to do anything, and they tax so much of our income. And all the land use controls and all this global warming stuff is just driving up the price of housing. So, yeah, California, we have the highest poverty rate in the nation under the Census Bureau's new cost of living adjusted formula, and it's obvious to see why. I mean, and it's all government policy driven, or most of it, not all of it, most of it. And the way to help poor people is not to give them a few more programs or pennies from the government, but is to create a thriving economy so that people have opportunities, so you can start small businesses. This all sounds like pablum. That's what Democrats hear when we talk like this, but it just happens to be true.
It's true.
I tell you,
that's all the truth we got. That's all the truth we've got time for with Stephen Greenhut. Hey, thanks for coming on with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Always love having you on, and we'll get you back to update the California insanity. But coming up, John Guandolo on the Islamic jihadist threat. Stay tuned. Hey, if you're just finding your way to the Radio Free California Network, you have already missed the first hour, but you're in luck because we've got a great guest coming up, and when he calls in, we'll bring him on. John Guandolo, who has written about the jihadi generation and the global Islamic movement. The jihadi movement, which, of course, as you know, we have spent quite a great deal of time trying to educate you as to the real threat, because the bottom line is our government doesn't seem to have any interest in stopping it. They can't even correctly identify it. Obama is fixated on taking away your guns, taking away the one tool from you that could potentially protect you from the actual live threat in front of you. And I want to read you a quote, because I'm going to read you a story a little bit later on with some comments by Taya Kyle, the widow of Chris Kyle, the American sniper. And in this piece that she wrote in CNN, it's a very long piece, but she's just brilliant and dead on. I love this quote from Reagan. Reagan once said, "You won't get gun control by disarming law-abiding citizens. There's only one way to get real gun control. Disarm the thugs and the criminals. Lock them up. And if you don't actually throw away the key, lose it for a long, long time." That is, man, it really makes me miss that guy. He had a way of putting into words, and it wasn't about Ronald Reagan as a man the way it is for Barack Obama. Everything's about Barack Obama. He's so great in his own mind. Whereas Reagan was about the people. He was about the country. And it's boy, I just miss having someone of that magnitude who could put into words the anger and the angst and the frustrations. But there's also that missing quantity. Anybody can bitch and moan, but what about the optimism and the understanding of who we are as a people and a country, he was able to articulate that. He was able to bring people together. We are seeing it to some extent with Donald Trump. I will admit that, and we are seeing that to a lesser degree than is necessary. To a lesser degree than I would desire. Let me say it that. It looks like our caller may not be calling in right now. So you know what I think I'm going to do is switch gears. I don't know if Sean. I don't know if it's if you could pull up that one clip we were talking about a little bit earlier, the one with the about the school marshal program, AB 202. Let me know when you have that ready. And meanwhile, I'm going to read a little bit of this. Wow, you're like a miracle worker. Let me preface this. One of the things, speaking about gun control, which we've been doing a lot, there is a shortage of deep thinking on this issue, and I had the privilege of being interviewed by Dennis Prager, who's one of the deepest thinkers I've ever heard on radio. He's just an absolutely brilliant individual. He's written many, many books, way smarter than me. I have no problem admitting that. And he wanted to defend me when I was proposing that we not deny people their Second Amendment rights simply because they're teachers. As a matter of fact, especially because they're teachers, when they might be confronted with a crazed, armed mass murderer in the gun-free zones that we know as schools. Here it is.
Tim Donnelly is a California assemblyman. He's a Republican. In California, you must understand, folks, Republican assemblyman is almost an oxymoron. It is. There are more bald eagles than there are Republican assemblymen. So to talk to one is immediately a sort of honor. But I want to welcome you to the show, Assemblyman Donnelly, who is from San Bernardino. How are you?
I am great, and I have to tell you, Dennis, the honor is all mine. I'm a long-time fan, and a very, very dear friend of mine who is my mentor, who passed away the day after I was elected, is the one who turned me on to you, and if he were alive today, he would be listening right now and thrilled that I was able to be on your show. So,
well, that touches me. Why don't we honor him? What's his name?
His name is Jim Blickenstaff.
Well, may he rest in peace, and thank you for telling me that story. Let me tell you why I'm asking you to be on. This is of national interest, even though I'm located, as you are, of course, in California. So I was reading about you from this article in the Los Angeles Times. A group of Republican state lawmakers that's last Wednesday, proposed allowing school districts to spend education funds to train teachers, administrators, and janitors in gun use. So here you're quoted. We have a moral obligation that the next Vicky Soto, referring to the terrible story of the teacher who was killed trying to protect her students at Sandy Hook in Connecticut. We have a moral obligation that the next Vicky Soto, who is faced with inexplicable evil, not be left defenseless. If she were armed, you're again quoted, she would have the ability to stop or at least slow down the killer. Donnelly said the proposal, AB 202, was modeled after the federal Air Marshal Program, which assigns armed, plainclothes officers to many commercial flights to guard against terrorism. And this is what really got my interest, because I thought what you said is about as logical as logic allows the human to develop. Senator Leland Yee, Democrat, oddly enough, San Francisco, a former school psychologist, said the bill would face insurmountable opposition in the legislation. With all due respect to my Republican colleagues, that bill is just absolutely ludicrous, Yee said. I don't know of any educator who would be interested in packing a gun into a school. Then the other one who took you on, Senator Ted Lieu, Democrat, Torrance, California, said the goal of school safety is not to see who can win a gunfight. It is to prevent shootings in the first place and keep guns out of schools. To which I said, I much prefer a gunfight to no gunfight.
Yeah, well, I think you said you prefer a gunfight to mass murder.
Yes. All right. That's even better. I thank you. I'm glad you heard me better than I just said it.
Well, I wish I had your debating skills when I went on television last Friday on Good Day Los Angeles, trying to answer people's questions. But what's very interesting is almost uniformly the teachers associations, the union, have been adamantly against this, but teachers are divided on the issue. So in some of the more conservative districts, you actually have teachers with the courage to say, hey, I would favor such a proposal. But parents are split almost 50-50, and one newspaper did a poll, and it was 51-49 in the beginning, and then it moved on to about 54% in favor of the proposal, and around 44% weren't, felt like it was a bad idea, and maybe, some other odd percent said we're not sure it's going to make any difference. So it's not as controversial as they're making out, and they're allowed to be armed under existing law, under the 1995 Gun-Free School Zone Act. So I'm not proposing to arm the teachers. I just think we ought to train them. And
Assemblyman Donnelly, it's worse than that. They don't claim it's controversial. That's the irony. They claim there's no controversy at all. Here is the other thing that I would mention, wherein Senator Yee, State Senator Yee, said, with all due respect to my colleagues, ludicrous, I don't know of any educator who would be interested in packing a gun into a school. And as I said, the man must live in a hermetically sealed world.
Maybe he's never been across one of the bridges out of San Francisco. I don't know.
That's right. That's exactly right. That may well be, or only the bridge that takes you east to Sacramento.
But exactly.
You're
we're
pointing
going to cut it
out
off here because we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to have John Guandolo, and we're going to be talking about the global Islamic jihadist threat. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome back to the Radio Free California Network. I am your host, former California State Assemblyman Tim Donnelly, and Radio Governor here in the state of California. We're going to bring on John Guandolo, who we've talked to before. He is an expert on terrorism, and he actually created and implemented the FBI's first counterterrorism training and education program. He's also the author of Raising a Jihadi Generation. And you can get that book at understandingthethreat.com or on Amazon. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks very much for having me again. I really appreciate it.
No, we're thrilled to have you back. And unfortunately, you may or may not be aware, but the listening area in which you are now communicating was the epicenter of the San Bernardino massacre. And so many people,
am aware of that.
They know people or had friends or neighbors. In my case, one of our neighbors whose friends of friends, and our kids were on teams together and all this sort of thing, were among the victims. And so there's a tremendous interest right now in really understanding this threat, because we don't feel like we're getting honest information or accurate information from many of the authorities who had 5 different stories when it came to the San Bernardino massacre. First they said, the perpetrators were white males, and then next thing you know, they figured out that they were jihadists. And every time we turn around, we're digging into new details. But in the end, it's almost as if our government is complicit with the threat of Islamic jihadism.
Well, that's right. And I guess to summarize for your audience first is that the understanding first needs to be about the network. And there are a couple key pieces. Number one, there was a massive trial, the largest terrorism financing and Hamas trial ever prosecuted in American history, which we've discussed before, the Holy Land Foundation trial in Dallas in 2008. It was a 15-year FBI investigation into the Holy Land Foundation. At the time it was indicted after 9/11, It was the largest Islamic charity in America, and it was a Hamas front. And Hamas being an inherent part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood established a significant network in the United States beginning in the early 60s with the Muslim Student Association through today. And what the evidence in this trial, the largest terrorism financing trial in American history, the evidence, the 15-year FBI investigation demonstrated is that most of the prominent Islamic organizations in the United States are a part of the jihadi network here that's either controlled by or works with the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood, whose stated objective in their own documents that the FBI discovered in a 2004 raid in Virginia, their objective is to wage civilization jihad to overthrow the government and impose Sharia law, which is the same objective as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab. The Islamic centers in and around San Bernardino subscribe to this ideology. As a matter of fact, the centers that we know now that the shooters had attended as part of the Dar al-Ulum al-Islamiyya of America, and that is specifically a group, a parallel Islamic movement. Or for your listeners, I'm going to try to keep it so we can kind of follow the conversation here. It's a movement like the Muslim Brotherhood that works with the Muslim Brotherhood called Tablighi Jamaat. And
that is exactly what I was going to ask you about. I couldn't remember. I was looking up as you're speaking. I'm looking up say it again. Tablighi Jamaat.
It's Tablighi Jamaat, and it's a group just like the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood's stated objective on their bylaws, which you can get a copy of their bylaws on my website, understandingthethreat.com, is twofold. Number one, their primary purpose is to impose Allah's law in the land, the Sharia in the land, and they also say in their bylaws that Muslims must fight the enemies and tyrants in order to establish the Islamic State. These are the same objectives. And so we have two things going on. One, you've got the Islamic centers and mosques and organizations like the Islamic societies around California, the Muslim Student Association, the Muslim American Society, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is Hamas, which was directly involved in this case right after the shooting. That's a Hamas group. And so that's not my professional opinion. That's a fact. They were formed by the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood to be a node for Hamas. That's what the evidence showed. It's what the federal trial judge said. It's what the appellate court panel judges said. This is not something that's up for debate. So the fact that these organizations come in, they're already there in San Bernardino, in Redlands. They already exist, just like in Boston. The Islamic Society of Boston produces guys like that bombed the Boston Marathon. The Islamic Center of Nashville produces a guy, as well as the Muslim Student Association at the school we went, produces a guy like Abdul Hakim Muhammad, a guy who grew up Baptist, gets recruited, and then gets sent and wages jihad and kills Private Andy Long at a recruiting center in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so what about the Islamic Center, the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center in Falls Church, Virginia, whose imam was Anwar al-Awlaki, the Al-Qaeda recruiter and guy that the government killed 4 years ago because he was an Al-Qaeda guy. He's leading the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center, who's, one of the guys that attended there was Major Nadal Hassan, who then kills Americans at Fort Hood. And it just goes on and on. You can tie all these attacks to these places that we know as a matter of legal fact and evidence are terrorist cells. They're jihadi networks. And because they're mosques, as soon as you talk about them, people are like, oh, you don't want to insult Islam. Like, well, actually, that's not my intention. My intention is to point out that there are terrorists in your neighborhood, and they're going to keep doing what they did in San Bernardino and other parts of the country. These are not.
And that right there That right there is, everybody that's listening right now, they get it, because we watched it happen here. And John, can we keep you one more segment, because we got cheated out of a couple minutes with you. Okay, and if you've got a question for John, I want you to call in, but let me give his website real quick, understandingthethreat.com. Check it out, and make sure you buy his book, Raising a Jihadi Generation, because this man is spreading the truth and understanding about a threat that is only too real to every one of you and I. Be right back. I just have to wait for that piano to come in. The classic Who here on the Tim Donnelly Show. We have a real classic, I don't know what else to call him, an American hero, John Guandolo. He is a former FBI agent. He created the first counterterrorism training education program and was assigned to that in Washington, D.C., has written or is co-author of Sharia, The Threat to America, and now he's releasing his new book, which is Raising a Jihadi Generation. And we've been talking to John about the real threat that many of us can see right here in San Bernardino, in the Redlands area, in the Corona area, and yet somehow our federal government decided to just take a pass for political correctness. John, I don't know if you're aware of all that. You probably are. But they were onto this Syed Farouk and his little band of terrorist buddies. And they got some of the ones that wanted to go abroad and kill our soldiers. But they ignored these guys. They let them go.
Well, there's a lot to this story. And there is a gentleman who has recently resigned from the Department of Homeland Security and the CBP, Customs and Border Protection, named Philip Haney, and he has spoken out and specifically said that not only was a part of his broader U.S. and international investigation into the terror network, did it include the Dar al-Ulum, which the mosque that the shooter there in San Bernardino went to, as we talked about earlier. But the government, the leadership of DHS, ordered him to remove over 60 files of individuals and organizations from the DHS Watch database who were terrorists, individual terrorists and terrorist organizations. Now, I want you to think about that, because, by the way, well, it's not insane. It's a criminal act.
Yeah,
and,
I mean...
he has briefed now members of the appropriate committees and all that in our government, but this is not going to be handled. I say it not for the point of the shock value. Americans have to understand that the federal government is not only not going after the network that is producing these people, they are openly defending them. What are we seeing in Boston after the killing and the Boston bombers, and specifically after the recent shooting of the Muslim who was a jihadi by the FBI agent? The Boston field office doubled its efforts to reach out to the Islamic Society of Boston, which is not only a Muslim Brotherhood front, it was founded by an Al-Qaeda guy who's in prison right now in the United States. So our response is to try to work even more with the same community. And I'm not talking about just some general Muslims that we're working with. The only people the federal government are working with, the only people that are working with the national security staff, the only people working and advising our leadership are easily identified as leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood at a senior level. Listen, I just
you got to be kidding.
No, I'm not kidding. Let me give you two quick examples. Imam Muhammad Majid, who was just stepped down as the president of the Islamic Society of North America. That's the organization that the evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial revealed was not only the, quote, nucleus for the Muslim Brotherhood movement in North America, It directly funded Hamas and Hamas leaders overseas. It still exists. It has not been indicted because Eric Holder shut down the prosecution of it and other Muslim Brotherhood organizations, but it's not indicted, and its leader, Mohammed Majid, still advises the National Security Staff. He still has a secret clearance and sits on the Homeland Security Advisory Committee. He still speaks at CIA headquarters at Langley. He still works with the Secretary of State and the previous 3 Secretaries of State. This is so easy. I think for a guy like me, I'm a Marine. I was a Marine officer. I'm a Naval Academy guy, served in the FBI. This stuff, when you see how easy this is to know, that to me is what's shocking, is that people will sit there and argue with you. This is not brain surgery. They tell you, we have their documents. Here's who we are. We have documents dating back to the 1980s.
John, I got to stop you for 1 minute. I got to stop you because I'm one of those people that 6 months ago or a year ago, I probably wouldn't have wanted to believe it, so I would have blocked it out, pushed it aside. But see, once I saw it happen here in my own community, and then to see the government and the way that they've been running around, I mean, literally, Obama couldn't cry any tears for any of the 14 victims. Couldn't bother to come here, but he immediately said, I'm going to take your guns, and you people better not say anything bad about Muslims in this country. And then he got Loretta Lynch to say she's going to shut down the First Amendment and start arresting people who tell the truth about Islamic fundamentalists. I mean, it's insane. And we're seeing it play out where our government is complicit.
That's right. That's right. And the thing is, here's the questions. One of the questions your listeners need to contemplate. If the FBI and the federal government is not only not helping, and they're actually defending the bad guys, now local and state law enforcement are kind of caught in the middle because they're not getting trained. The FBI is certainly not training. My training program that I do, the 3-day law enforcement program, is the only one like it in the country. And everywhere I go, it's a battle because I'm dealing with the feds who don't want it there, and then I'm dealing with the Muslim organizations who protest. But as soon as the cops hear the information and see it factually, they see the evidence, they are absolutely blown away, and then they're angry because they say this is easy to get. These guys are really bad, and you're just all I do is lay it out. You make the call. Here it is. Look, I just went to the Facebook site of the Islamic Community Center Redlands, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. They have an obituary for Dr. Ahmad Sakhr, who was one of the original Muslim brothers who came to this country and founded the Muslim Student Association, which the federal court in the largest Hamas and terrorism financing trial in American history said the MSA is, documents showed the MSA was founded by the Muslim Brotherhood. And there's his obituary right there. So they're telling you, here's who we are. Here's what our philosophy is. Look at what they teach. It's not that hard. I mean, when I go around and I teach, I have textbooks from Islamic schools, and I say, here, you read it. And I will hand the microphone to somebody, a cop, or somebody in the audience, or an elected official, or a state legislator, or a mayor. Say, you read it. Read what they're teaching, because what they're teaching is exactly what ISIS teaches. It's actually what the Muslim Brotherhood teaches their people. It's what Al-Qaeda teaches its people. So the question is, if they're doing it at 7th grade at the Islamic schools right here in the United States, shouldn't that be a little red flag? That, in the world I come from, that's called reasonable suspicion and probable cause. And we can execute search warrants. The back of my book, Raising a Jihadi Generation, is literally a boilerplate for a statement of facts for a search or arrest warrant. We don't have a lack of factual evidence. We have a lack of courage and principled leadership who refuses to do what needs to be done. And, people crying that they're offended, be damned. I mean, I'm sorry if it offends you that you're killing our people. I'm sorry that when you kill us, that offends you. It offends me that they're dead. It offends me that people are dead at Fort Hood, that people are dead in Little Rock, Arkansas, that people are dead in Arlington and New York, that people are dead in San Bernardino, people are dead in Paris and France and Spain.
Well,
and
they're dead. They're dead.
And
I'm on top of a mountain in a little tiny community, and we lost 2 people in that jihadi attack at a Christmas party. People who were at work. One was a father of 6, Michael Wetzel, and this little town of Lake Arrowhead, Twin Peaks, etc., is maybe 30,000 people at the maximum. This is small town America. This has hit us between the eyes, and I think our eyes are open now. So let me ask you this: what can we do? Is because it seems to me that this course you're teaching needs to be learned here by the San Bernardino sheriffs. It needs to be learned by the local police departments in this local area, because this mosque is not going to stop. They're not going to turn in the people that they know are planning the next jihadist attack.
No, they won't.
Have they reached out to you, or should we start pushing them to get you in there? Because this kind of training sounds really important to me.
Well, it is, and I just want to let me tell your audience. I'll give you a quick vignette, and then you can tell me.
Sure.
The importance of this training. 2 parts to the story. First, 4 years ago at Headquarters Marine Corps, I was teaching about 115 folks, 3-day program, the same program I'm talking about. In the middle of day 3, right before lunch, a guy stood up and he said, "John, I've been in the FBI 14 years. I'm a supervisor at the Counterterrorism Division at FBI headquarters, and I've never heard the information you've put out over here the last 2.5 days." And
wow.
He then used some very colorful language to say how angry he was. And so I asked, I said, raise your hand if you did not know this, or excuse me, raise your hand if you knew this information before you came in here 3 days ago. Now, the room was full of people from DHS, CIA, NSA. We had a few NSA people there. We had FBI. We had Joint Terrorism Task Force people from Maryland, Virginia, D.C. We had local and state cops from those same areas. We had some military people there. We had some college police. We had 2 foreign folks that had come down from Canada that I had invited. So we had a whole room. I said, raise your hand if you knew this 3 days ago before you came in here, and not one hand went up. You want to know why we aren't defeating this? It's because the programs to articulate the threat and how to deal with it have been completely shut down by our government. So if your locale, your county, specifically county, your city, wants to know what's going on, the idea of looking to the FBI for guidance is out the window. And the second part of that story is a number of months ago when I was in Arizona, I gave a 1-day intro course to 300 cops from all over the state of Arizona. And at the end of that day, I said, raise your hand if you knew this before you walked in here. And nobody raised their hands. And I said, raise your hand if you're on or have served on an FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. And about 30 people raised their hands.
Wow.
And none of them knew this.
So
now, this is the state of affairs where we're in. This is why this training and education is so important. But it's also important for citizens to understand this, because there's a lot citizens can do in your community, but you got to understand the threat before you start talking about solutions.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, your website is well named, understandingthethreat.com. People can contact you through there, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, John Guandolo, former FBI agent. I don't know what to call you now because you're sort of a teacher, professor.
Yeah, I do national security consulting as well as.
Okay, national security consultant, author of Raising a Jihadi Generation. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for really clearing up some of these questions. And we definitely want to have you back on, because this is an ongoing situation here, and I hope you'll be willing to join us again in the future.
Absolutely, and I just encourage you and your listeners to, I write articles regularly on my blog, and I just started this week, the first one of the year, with Understanding the Threat, and today's article on Sharia, and it's going to slowly, in small bites, very tight, very short, giving people a little education, one bite at a time, and over the next couple of months. So that's a simple way, too, for people to just kind of at least get the building blocks.
Great.
And certainly the book, I wrote the book to do the same thing. So I appreciate being on, and I'll keep you guys out there in my prayers. I really appreciate what you've gone through.
God bless you and Godspeed, my friend. We've got to take a break. Otherwise, I would keep you on because I love talking to you. We're going to be right back after this. But understandingthethreat.com is his website. Raising a Jihadi Generation. This is information we need to know. It's hard to follow that kind of incredible knowledge. What an incredible resource. It always gives me hope when I look around and I see that there are people who will buck the system. They will fight against the establishment, even if it costs them a job or an opportunity or a promotion. And John Donnelly is definitely one of those. And he is someone who is now spending his time bringing awareness of a threat. And look, as Americans, we tend to be slow to come around, I believe, to recognizing a threat. It takes education. Think about the threat of the Nazis. You think everybody was all of a sudden on board and understood that Hitler was as evil as he was? No. It took before every movie, there would be a film reel, a news reel, and they would show you. And when they started to show the American public the concentration camps and the locations that they had liberated and the stories of abject horror, the American public came around real quick. But before that, it was just, it was hard to know. It was, and I think it's that way with a lot of things. You don't want to believe that something as innocuous sounding as the Muslim Student Association is sponsored by and founded by the Muslim Brotherhood. You don't want to know that the Muslim Brotherhood has penetrated the highest levels of our government, and they're routinely giving speeches and advising policy and policy decisions to the law enforcement that are supposed to be stamping out and preventing the next terrorist attack from Islamic jihadists. And when you learn, as we have, and he made reference to, I believe it's Philip Haney, who was basically kicked out, given a golden parachute, hey, go away. And they deleted all the files. He had amassed a tremendous amount of evidence on a lot of these Islamic groups, but the politically correct police came in and they shut down the investigations, and Americans died, including the 14 here in San Bernardino as a result of that. That blood is on the hands of our government. Be right back after these messages. Hey, welcome back to the Radio Free California Network. I am Tim Donnelly, your host, former California State Assemblyman and radio governor here in the state of California. And we are going to do something a little bit unusual. We are going to join the Obama Town Hall meeting live and in progress I'm not sure what town it's in. I don't know if, Sean, if you can tell me that. See, Fairfax, Virginia. Always there with all the answers. Well, if that's live, let's kick over to that and see what they're talking about.
I respect people who want a gun for self-protection, for hunting, for sportsmanship. But all of us can agree that it makes sense to do everything we can to keep guns out of the hands of people who would try to do others harm or to do themselves harm. Because every year we're losing 30,000 people to gun violence. 2/3 of those are actually suicides. Hundreds of kids under the age of 18 are being shot or shooting themselves, often by accident, many of them under the age of 5. And so if we can combine gun safety with sensible background checks and some other steps, we're not going to eliminate gun violence, but we will lessen it. And if we take that number from 30,000 down to, let's say, 28,000, that's 2,000 families who don't have to go through what the families at Newtown or San Bernardino or Charleston went through. And so what we've proposed is that if you have a background check system that has a bunch of big loopholes, which is why a lot of criminals and people who shouldn't have guns are able to get guns.
But they're not buying them at gun shows. Only 1% of criminals are buying them at gun shows.
No, but this is what happens. Let's go back to the city of Chicago that has strong gun control laws. And oftentimes the NRA will point to that as an example and say, see, these things don't work. Well, the problem is that about 30-40% of those guns are coming from Indiana across the border where there are much laxer laws. And so folks will go to a gun show and purchase a whole bunch of firearms, put them in a van, drive up into Mike Flager's neighborhood on the south side of Chicago where his parish is, open up the trunk, and those things are for sale. Now, technically, you could say those folks bought them illegally, but it was facilitated by the fact that what used to be a small exception that said collectors and hobbyists don't need to go through a background check has become this massive industry where people who are doing business are, in fact, saying that they're not in the business of selling guns, but are. And all we're saying here is that we want to put everybody on notice that the definition of doing business, which means you have to register, and it means you have to run a background check, is if you are making a profit and repeatedly selling guns, then you should have to follow the same rules as every other gun dealer. And what
there's a lot of people who believe that's not specific enough, because there's a lot of fathers and sons who sell guns every now and then, and at gun shows, are they going to have to now start doing background checks? Are they going to start to have to register?
Look, what the Justice Department has done is provided a whole range of very specific examples. And what we ultimately need, I believe, is for Congress to set up a system that is efficient, that doesn't inconvenience the lawful gun seller or purchaser, but that makes sure that we're doing the best background check possible. And the fact, Anderson, that the system may not catch every single person, or there may be a circumstance where somebody doesn't think that they have to register and do, and that may cause some red tape and bureaucracy for them, or inconvenience, has to be weighed against the fact that we may be able to save a whole bunch of families from the grief that some of the people in this audience have had to go through. And keep in mind, for the gun owners who are in attendance here, my suspicion is that you all had to go through a background check. And it didn't prevent you from getting a weapon. And the notion that you should have to do that, but there are a whole bunch of folks who are less responsible than you who don't have to do it, doesn't make much sense. So why we should resist this? Keep in mind that historically, the NRA was in favor of background checks. Historically, many in the Republican Party were in favor of background checks. And what's changed is not that my proposals are particularly radical. What's changed is we've suddenly created an atmosphere in which I put out a proposal like background checks, or after Sandy Hook, we're calling on Congress, along with people like Gabby Gifford, who herself was a victim of gun violence. We put out a proposal that is common sense, modest, does not claim to solve every problem, is respectful of the Second Amendment, and the way it is described is that we're trying to take away everybody's guns. And part of the reason I welcomed this opportunity by CNN to have a good discussion, debate about it, is because our position is consistently mischaracterized. And by the way, there's a reason why the NRA is not here. They're just down the street. And since this is the main reason they exist, you'd think that they'd be prepared to have a debate with the president.
They haven't been to the White House in 4 years.
We've invited them. We've invited them.
So right now, tonight, you're saying you would be welcome to meet.
We have invited them repeatedly. But if you listen to the rhetoric, it is so over the top and so overheated, and most importantly, is not acknowledging the fact that there's no other...
I'm sorry. Obama, I know he's lying because his lips are moving, and you know that too, but my gosh. He makes this big deal the other day about how we're not going to talk past each other. He didn't allow the NRA to come there. He didn't invite the NRA to come there. He actually had this entire meeting was pre-screened with only people who will agree with him or they will disagree with him with very carefully worded questions so that they can pretend to be law-abiding gun owners who really support Obama's gun control tyranny. I don't know how much more I can take. We'll go for another 2 minutes and then we're going to take a break.
Toys. We say, you know what? We find out that kids are swallowing toys all the time. Let's make sure that the toys aren't so small that they swallow them if they're for toddlers or infants. Medicine. Kids can't open aspirin caps. Now, the notion that we would not apply the same basic principles to gun ownership as we do to everything else that we own, but just to try to make them safer, or the notion that anything we do to try to make them safer is somehow a plot to take away guns, that contradicts what we do to try to create a better life for Americans in every other area of our lives.
So just so I'm clear, tonight you're saying you would welcome to meet with the NRA.
Anderson, I've said this repeatedly. I'm happy to meet with him. I'm happy to talk to him. But the conversation has to be based on facts and truth and what we're actually proposing, not some imaginary fiction in which Obama's trying to take away your guns.
Well, let's talk about what you're proposing.
The reason, by the way, that the gun
let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages. Hey, we're going to go right back to this meeting in Fairfax, Virginia. Taya Kyle was just speaking.
Protecting all of us, and I'm very grateful for that. Number two, what you said about murder rates and violent crime generally is something that we don't celebrate enough. The fact of the matter is that violent crime has been steadily declining across America for a pretty long time. And you wouldn't always know it by watching television. But overall, most cities are much safer than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Now, I challenge the notion that the reason for that is because there's more gun ownership. Because if you look at where are the areas with the highest gun ownership, those are the places in some cases where the crime rate hasn't dropped down that much, and the places where there's pretty stiff restrictions on gun ownership, in some of those places the crimes dropped really quickly. So I'm not sure that there's a one-to-one correlation.
That's just untrue. That's completely made up out of whole cloth. Chicago, massive gun control. It's a war zone. People are dying on the streets every day. You go to Arizona, you go to Texas, and crime rates are null and void.
Somebody will intend to commit a crime, but they don't have a record that shows up on the background check system. But in the same way that we don't eliminate all traffic accidents, but over the course of 20 years, traffic accidents get lower. There's still tragedies. There's still drunk drivers. There's still people who don't wear their seatbelts. But over time, that violence was reduced, and so families are spared. That's the same thing that we can do with gun ownership. There is a way for us to set up a system where you, a responsible gun owner, who I'm assuming, given your husband and your family, is a much better marksman than I am, can have a firearm to protect yourself. But where it is much harder for somebody to fill up a car with guns and sell them to 13-year-old kids on the streets. And that is, I think, what we're trying to do. What we're also trying to do is make the database more effective. So that's part of the proposal, which, by the way, will convenience you when you go to the store, because if we can set up a 24/7 background check system, then that means that it's less likely that things slip through the cracks, or it's more difficult for you to get your background check completed. And we're also trying to close a loophole that has been developing over the last decade, where now people are using cutout trusts and shell corporations to purchase the most dangerous weapons. Sawed-off shotguns, automatic weapons, silencers, and don't have to go through background checks at all. And we don't know whether, are these sales going to drug traffickers? Are they? We don't know who's purchasing them right now, and so what we're saying is,
if you don't know who's purchasing them, you're really ineffective at doing anything, and you should be kicked out of the presidency. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. Gun trusts and corporations have done this for a long, long time. Not a single crime has ever been committed with any of those weapons, by the way. We dealt with this here in the California legislature.
That a good guy with a gun or a good woman with a gun is an important bulwark against a bad person with a gun. And before you answer, I want you to meet Kimberly Corbin. Kimberly was a college student in Colorado in 2006. Kimberly's right over there. She was raped by a man who broke into her apartment. She testified for 3 hours in the trial against him. Her attacker was sentenced to 24 years to life in prison. And I know that attack, Kimberly, changed your view of handguns. What's your question for the president?
Absolutely. As a survivor of rape and now a mother to 2 small children, it seems like being able to purchase a firearm of my choosing and being able to carry that wherever me and my family are, it seems like my basic responsibility as a parent at this point. I have been unspeakably victimized once already, and I refuse to let that happen again to myself or my kids. So why can't your administration see that these restrictions that you're putting to make it harder for me to own a gun or harder for me to take that where I need to be is actually just making my kids and I less safe?
Well, Kimberly, first of all, obviously, your story is horrific. The strength you've shown in telling your story and being here tonight is remarkable, and so really proud of you for that. I just want to repeat that there's nothing that we've proposed that would make it harder for you to purchase a firearm. And now, you may be referring to issues like concealed carry, but those tend to be state-by-state decisions. And we're not making any proposals with respect to what states are doing. They can make their own decisions there. So there really is nothing that we're proposing that prevents you or makes it harder for you to purchase a firearm if you need one. There are always questions as to whether or not having a firearm in the home protects you from that kind of violence. And I'm not sure we can resolve that. People argue it both sides. What is true is that you have to be pretty well trained in order to fire a weapon against somebody who is assaulting you and catches you by surprise. And what is also true is there's always the possibility that that firearm in a home leads to a tragic accident. We can debate that round or flat. But for now, what I just want to focus on is that You certainly would like to make it a little harder for that assailant to have also had a gun. You certainly would want to make sure that if he gets released...
It's a typical elitist attitude that you've got to be trained. The founders never said anything about being trained. They did say a well-regulated militia, which, you know what, if you go to the range, you find a well-regulated militia at every range, every weekend, and almost every weekday in this country. But that woman with a gun in her hand while she was being raped, if she'd been able to pull it out of her purse or wherever she kept it on her person and shoot the guy and roll him off her, then I'm sure she would have been grateful to be able to stop the evil that was taking place. And she doesn't need an idiot lecturing her on it. How did you hear what he said? Your story was horrific. No, her story was gripping. It wasn't horrific. What happened to her was horrific. And
that can be debated. In the meantime,
sorry, I'm just
focused on is making sure that a crime like yours that was committed is not made easier because somebody can go on the internet and just buy whatever weapon they want without us finding out whether they're a criminal or not.
Kimberly, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. You talked about Chicago, and there's a lot of folks from Chicago here tonight. I want you to meet, or I want everybody to meet, because I know you've met her before, Cleo Pendleton. She's sitting over there. And I should point out, I think I said it earlier, 55 shootings in Chicago in just the past 7 days. Cleo Pendleton, her daughter, Hadiya, performed at your second inauguration. She was shot to death a little more than a week later. She was 15 years old. She was an honor student, a majorette, and you being here tonight honors her. So thank you very much for being here. What's your question to the president?
Well, I want to say thank you, first of all, for making it more difficult for guns to get in the hands of those that shouldn't have them. Thank you for the action you took on Tuesday. But I want to ask a question. How can we stop the trafficking of guns from states with looser gun laws into states with tougher gun laws? Because I believe that's the case, often in Chicago.
I hope somebody mentions the fact that Obama's administration trafficked guns from Arizona, tens of thousands of them, into the hands of the drug cartels who killed thousands of Mexicans and hundreds of Americans with them.
Young people, and they tell their stories, at least for me. I think of Malia, and I think of Sasha, and I think of my nieces, and I think of my nephews, and the pain that any of us go through with a loss like that is extraordinary.
We're going to have to take a break. I'm sorry that you're not going to be victimized by having to listen to more pablum from the so-called president. We'll be right back.
Since we can't identify that person all the time, are there ways for us to make it less lethal when something like that happens? And I mentioned this during my speech at the White House a couple of days ago. Right around the time of Newtown in China, a guy who was obviously similarly deranged had a knife and started attacking a bunch of school children. About the same number were cut or stabbed by this guy. But most of them survived. And the reason was because he wasn't yielding a semi-automatic. So the main point I think that I want to make here is that everybody here is in favor of going after criminals, locking them up, making sure that we're creating an environment where kids don't turn into criminals, and providing the support that they need. Those are all important things. Nobody's saying we need to be going soft on criminals. What we do have to make sure of is that we don't make it so easy for them to have access to deadly weapons. In neighborhoods like Chicago, but I keep on using Chicago, this is all across the country. You go to any neighborhood. It used to be that parents would see some kids messing around on the corner, and they'd say, yo, even if they weren't the parent of those children, go back inside, stop doing that. And over time, it was a lot harder to discipline somebody else's kid and have the community maintain order or talk to police officers if somebody's doing something wrong, because now somebody is worried about getting shot. And if we can create an environment that's just a little bit safer in those communities, that will help. And if it doesn't infringe on your Second Amendment rights, and it doesn't infringe on your Second Amendment rights, and you're still able to get a firearm for your protection, why wouldn't we want to do that?
We got to take a break. We're going to take a quick break. Our live town hall conversation on guns in America with President Barack Obama continues right after this.
Hey, they had Sheriff Paul Bebu, no stranger to the audience of this show, and certainly a great American who grilled the president on the Fast and Furious gun program. I wish we would have been able to get well, we'll see if we can get you some audio on that tomorrow, because that's something that Sheriff Paul Bebu went after repeatedly. And here you have the government doing the very thing that it states that it's trying to stop. And yet the government was the perpetrator. Obama's government. Did I say that? Eric Holder. Oh, it's interesting. We heard about Eric Holder earlier today when it came to the protecting the Muslim Brotherhood who fill our government and who are in high positions, and they're the ones who are watching the hen house. You've got the fox watching the hen house, and everybody wonders why we're being attacked and why the government is not doing anything effective to stop it. And why is the government spying on Americans, and yet it has been sworn off and verboten, forbidden to spy on Islamic groups that are radicalized, that are fundamentalist, that are funded by the Muslim Brotherhood. They're funded, they're in many cases, they are jihadist organizations. And it's just one of those things that when you start to connect the dots, you realize that we are in serious trouble. We're going to take a quick break and be right back after these messages. Hey, welcome back. We are listening to the Fairfax, Virginia gun town hall held by President Obama. And
so that 10 years from now, 20 years from now,
you're going to listen to it.
The crime rate has gone down. That's not just because of my administration. The groundwork was laid by a bunch of good work by law enforcement and others for years across administrations on a bipartisan basis. The same is true with traffic safety. The same is true with advances in medicine. The same can be true with this if we stop exaggerating or mischaracterizing the positions of either side, and we just come up with some sensible areas that people agree with. Background checks are an example. The majority of gun owners agree with this.
You talk about faith communities. Father Michael Flager is here. I know you know him well. He's a Roman Catholic priest in Chicago. For those who don't know, his church is St. Sabina on the south side of Chicago. I was there about a month ago. It was a great honor to be there. Father, you've given a lot of eulogies for a lot of kids in your community, far too many over the 40 years that you have been there. What's your question for the president?
Mr. President, first of all, thank you for your courage and your passion, and keep pushing. I happen to be from one of those cities where violence is not going down. Not only, as Anderson mentioned, the 55 shot, there's been 11 killed in 7 days in Chicago. One of the main reasons for that is the easy access to guns. It's easier to get a gun in my neighborhood than it is a computer. And the reality is because many of those guns have been bought legally. And I understand why people are pushing against you, because they understand it's a business and it's about a business. And so if we cut back the easy access to guns, less money for the gun manufacturers, less money for the gun lobby, I understand the business of it, but that business is causing blood. And the kids that are dying in Chicago, and for many years, nobody even cared about Chicago because the violence is primarily black and brown. The reality is that I don't understand why we can't title guns just like cars. If I have a car and I give it to you, Mr. President, and I don't transfer a title and you're in an accident, it's on me. We don't take cars away by putting titles on them. Why can't we do that with guns? And every gun in America. So if somebody who's buying 200 guns, selling them on the streets, if they can't transfer those titles, then they're going to be held responsible for the guns that they sell.
Well, Father Mike, first of all, for those of you who don't know him, has been working since before I moved to Chicago, and I was a 23-year-old when I first met him. And somehow I aged and he didn't.
Your gray hair is not going back. I can tell you from experience.
He was always the best-looking priest in Chicago. So, but Father Flager's done heroic work at St. Sabina Parish. Issues like licensing, registration, that's an area where there's just not enough national consensus at this stage to even consider it. And part of it is people's concern that that becomes a prelude to taking people's guns away. I mean, part of the challenge in this is that the gun debate gets wrapped up in broader debates about whether the federal government is oppressive, and there are conspiracy theories floating around the internet these days all the time. We did a military exercise in Texas, and a whole bunch of folks were sure that this was the start of martial law, and were suggesting maybe don't cooperate with the United States Army in an effort to prepare so that if they get deployed overseas, they can handle it. But that's how difficult sometimes these debates are. But I want to pick up on some things where I think there should be consensus. One of those areas that I talked about at the speech, part of the proposal, is developing smart gun technology. Now, this is an interesting example. I don't exactly understand this, and maybe there will be somebody in the audience who explains it to me. Back in 1997, the CEO of Colt said, we can design or are starting to develop guns where you can only use it if you've got a chip. So you wear a band or a bracelet, and that then protects your 2-year-old or 3-year-old from picking up the gun and using it. And a boycott was called against them, and they had to back off of developing that technology. The same with Smith & Wesson. They were in the process of developing similar technology, and they were attacked by the NRA as surrendering. Now, to me, this does not make sense. If you are a gun owner, I would think that you would at least want a choice so that if you wanted to purchase a firearm that could only be used by you, in part to avoid accidents in your home, in part to make sure that if it's stolen, it's not used by a criminal, in part if there's an intruder, you pull the gun, but somehow it gets wrested away from you, that gun can't be turned on you and used on you. I would think there might be a market for that. You could sell that gun. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily would be the only gun that's available, but it seems to me that that would be something that in any other area, in any other product, any other commercial venture, there'd be some research and development on that because that's a promising technology. It has not been developed primarily because it's been blocked by either the NRA, which are funded by gun manufacturers, or
no, but that's not the only reason it hasn't been developed, because it's insanely expensive. It's questionable as to how well it would work, and it would actually put you at risk. And we've talked about this before, and we'll talk about it again. But
that's an example of how we could reduce some of the preventable gun deaths that are out there.
I want to bring in somebody who actually knows a lot about selling guns. I want you to meet Chris Jacob. He's vice president of the American Firearms Retailers Association. He's the owner of the Bullseye Indoor Shooting Range and Gun Store in San Rafael, California. Chris, it's great to have you here. First of all, how is business under President Obama? Because everything I read says gun sales have been going up. Every time he talks about guns, gun sales go up.
It's been busy, and certainly I think that shows, as Taya said earlier, that there's a very serious concern in this country about personal security. And the sheriff is right. They do everything they possibly can to make sure they get there as quickly as they possibly can. And my question is actually focused around law enforcement as well. There's 53,000 licensed gun dealers in the United States who stand behind the counter and say no to people all day.
Yep.
We feel it's our responsibility to make sure that people who have a criminal past, people who are mentally ill or are having a bad day, don't get possession of firearms. So we assist law enforcement all the time in the process of making sure that those things don't change hands inside our commercial market if they shouldn't. It's a very serious responsibility for us, and as a group, we take it very seriously. My question is around the executive order related to the investigators, the inspectors, the adding of 200 inspectors who are more on the auditing and record-keeping side. Why not add 200 ATF agents on the law enforcement side to keep the criminals and the bad guys out of the stores in the first place? I mean, the problem seems to me to be, you mentioned dealers who are less responsible than others, and certainly it's possible that those folks are out there. But if we can enforce the laws that already exist, the tens of thousands of gun laws that are on the books right now, it might create a very significant deterrent
and Chris,
getting those people in the
Let me also point out the number of ATF agents during your administration has actually declined. So even if you hired 200
not
more,
because of my budget.
But even if you hired 200 more, it'll get it to what it was right before you took office.
Well, look, first of all, there are a whole bunch of responsible gun dealers out there. And my hope would be that those gun dealers would support making sure that everybody's following the same rules that they are. That's number one. Number two is we're not writing a new law. Only Congress can do that. This is about enforcing existing laws and closing what has grown into a massive loophole where a huge percentage of guns, many of whom end up being traced to crime, are not going through the responsible gun dealers, but are going through irresponsible folks who are not registered as doing business. And the whole goal here is to clarify and to put on notice that if you're a business...
You'll note, he said, irresponsible, if you don't register, you're irresponsible. Well, what is the purpose of registration except to eventually have a list for confiscation? Come on.
And that should not be something that threatens responsible gun dealers across the country. In terms of the ATF, it is absolutely true that the ATF budget has been shrunk. It's a little late, but you knew what I meant. And part of it is because the politicizing of this issue. So many in the Republican Congress feel as if the ATF is not their friend but their enemy. Part of the story I was telling.
This issue should be politicized, though.
Well, but what I mean by that, Anderson, is that they have been portrayed as trying to take people's guns away, as opposed to trying to make sure that the laws are enforced. And one of the most frustrating things that I hear is when people say, who are opposed to any further laws, why don't you just enforce the laws that are on the books? And those very same members of Congress then cut ATF budgets to make it impossible to enforce the law. And so it is, and by the way, the ATF is a law enforcement agency working under the FBI that is doing enormous work in going after criminals and drug cartels and have a pretty dangerous job. So it's not as if...
Did he just say they're going after the drug cartels? They're arming the drug cartels. Okay, you got to turn him off. You have to shut down this man. I cannot take one more minute. They're arming. They armed the drug cartels. The drug cartels killed one of our Border Patrol agents. Numerous other individuals on both sides of the border have been murdered with guns that Barack Obama's own administration under Eric Holder trafficked to dangerous criminals. You could even call them terrorists. They're cartel terrorists. And he wants to lecture us? He wants to protect the government. He wants to protect this country from you and I, from us getting our hands on something that is guaranteed in the Constitution as our lawful right. You always cut me off right when I get going. Anyway, you'll have to tune in tomorrow. Thanks to Sean McNeil, our chief engineer, all of our sponsors, and you. God bless you and Godspeed. Tim Donnelly Show, out.